In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where golden spires pierce the morning sky and secrets lurk behind every marble column, a single photograph was about to destroy 3 generations of carefully constructed lies. Queen Isabella stood frozen in her private chambers, her trembling hands clutching a letter that had arrived with the dawn, a letter that threatened to expose the truth she had buried 25 years ago. Outside her window, King Alexander paced the royal gardens with unusual urgency, his face darkened by a conversation that had shaken him to his core. Their son, Prince Marcus, the heir to the throne, was about to discover that everything he believed about his birth, his bloodline, and his right to rule was built on a foundation of deception. As storm clouds gathered over the palace, 3 lives hung in the balance, and the very future of the monarchy teetered on the edge of revelation. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of Castle Valdoria, casting rainbow patterns across the polished marble floors. Queen Isabella Montclair stood motionless before her ornate vanity mirror, her reflection revealing a woman who had learned to mask her emotions behind decades of royal protocol. At 52, she remained elegant, her auburn hair perfectly arranged, her posture straight despite the weight of the secret that had pressed upon her shoulders for 25 years. The letter in her hands, written on cream-colored parchment with an unfamiliar seal, had arrived just an hour ago with the Morning Post. The words seemed to burn through the paper as she read them again. Your Majesty, the time has come for Prince Marcus to learn the truth about his parentage. Lord Edmund Blackwood has evidence that cannot be ignored any longer. The DNA results are conclusive. We request an audience within the week, or we shall be forced to make this matter public. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as memories she had tried so desperately to bury came rushing back like a flood. 26 years ago, she had been young, barely married a year to King Alexander, and struggling with the immense pressure of producing an heir. The marriage had been arranged for a political alliance, bringing together the northern territories with the southern kingdoms. But love had been slow to develop. Alexander, though kind and dutiful, had been distant, consumed with learning the complexities of ruling a kingdom from his aging father. During those lonely months, Isabella had found solace in her childhood friend, Lord Edmund Blackwood, who served as the royal ambassador to neighboring kingdoms. Edmund had always understood her in ways that Alexander couldn't, sharing her love of literature and art, her dreams of traveling beyond the kingdom's borders. What had started as innocent friendship had gradually blossomed into something deeper, something forbidden. Their secret meetings in the palace library, their stolen conversations in the rose garden, their shared glances during state dinners, all of it had led to one night of passion that would change everything. When Isabella discovered she was pregnant 3 months later, panic had consumed her. The timing could have suggested either man as the father, but in her heart, she feared the truth. Edmund had been sent away on a diplomatic mission to the far eastern kingdoms just days after their encounter, and Alexander, overjoyed by news of the pregnancy, had become the attentive husband she had always hoped for. As months passed, and little Marcus was born with Alexander's dark hair and strong jawline, Isabella had convinced herself that fate had been kind. The resemblance seemed to confirm Alexander as the father, and she had buried her doubts deep within her heart. Now, as she stood in her chambers holding this devastating letter, all those carefully constructed certainties crumbled around her. Lord Edmund had returned to court 6 months ago after serving abroad for over 2 decades. Age had silvered his temples and lined his face, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had captured her heart so long ago. They had maintained polite distance, speaking only when necessary at state functions, but Isabella had noticed his intense study of Prince Marcus during public appearances. Prince Marcus, now 25, and preparing to marry Lady Catherine Ashford in a ceremony that would unite 2 powerful noble houses, was the very image of what a future king should be. Tall and broad-shouldered like Alexander, with the same commanding presence, he had excelled in his royal education, mastering languages, diplomacy, and military strategy. The people adored him, and his upcoming marriage promised to strengthen the kingdom's alliances. But if Edmund's claims were true, if DNA evidence proved that Marcus was not Alexander's biological son, the scandal would destroy not only her family, but potentially the entire monarchy. Isabella's mind raced through the possibilities. How had Edmund obtained DNA for testing? When? And more importantly, what did he want? Money? Power? Or was he driven by a father's desire to know his son? The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of guilt and terror. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Your Majesty," came the voice of her personal secretary, Lady Margaret Winters, a woman who had served the royal family for over 15 years with unwavering discretion. "His Majesty requests your presence in the garden. He says it's urgent." Isabella quickly folded the letter and slipped it into a hidden compartment of her jewelry box, her hand surprisingly steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Tell His Majesty I'll be down shortly," she replied, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within. She spent several minutes composing herself, applying just enough powder to hide the pallor that had crept in her cheeks, and selecting a deep blue dress that conveyed both authority and serenity. As she walked through the palace corridors toward the royal gardens, her heels clicking against the marble floors, Isabella forced herself to breathe deeply and prepare for whatever Alexander needed to discuss. The royal gardens of Castle Valdoria were renowned throughout the kingdom for their beauty. Stretching across several acres behind the palace, they featured intricate maze-like pathways lined with roses, lavender, and exotic flowers imported from distant lands. Marble fountains provided gentle background music, while ancient oak trees offered shade and privacy for important conversations away from the ever-present ears of palace staff and courtiers. Isabella found Alexander near the central fountain, his tall frame pacing back and forth with unusual agitation. At 55, the king remained an imposing figure, his dark hair now touched with distinguished silver, his bearing still commanding despite the stress lines that had deepened around his eyes in recent years. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, having abandoned his formal royal attire for this private moment. "Alexander," Isabella called softly as she approached, her voice carrying the warmth that had grown genuine over their years together. Despite the arranged nature of their marriage, they had built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dedication to their kingdom and son. He turned at the sound of her voice, and Isabella was struck by the troubled expression on his face. "Isabella, thank God you're here. We need to talk, and I'm afraid what I have to tell you will be difficult to hear." Her blood ran cold, and for a moment she wondered if somehow Alexander had learned about Edmund's letter. "What's happened?" she asked, moving to sit on the marble bench beside the fountain. Alexander joined her, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she recognized as a sign of extreme stress. "I received a visit this morning from Lord Edmund Blackwood. He requested a private audience, and what he told me." Alexander paused, shaking his head as if he still couldn't believe it. "Isabella, he claims that Marcus is his son." The world seemed to tilt around Isabella, and she gripped the edge of the marble bench to steady herself. That's impossible," she managed to whisper, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "That's exactly what I told him," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I told him he was delusional, that such accusations against the crown would be considered treason. But, Isabella, he had evidence. Documents, photographs, even—" He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Even DNA test results." Isabella's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "DNA results? How could he possibly have obtained such things?" Alexander stood and resumed his pacing, his hands clenched behind his back. "He claims he had samples tested months ago. Hair from Marcus's hairbrush, a water glass he drank from at a state dinner. I don't know how he managed it, but he seemed very confident in his evidence." The implications hit Isabella like physical blows. If Edmund had already conducted DNA testing and was confident enough to confront the king directly, then her worst fears were likely confirmed. Marcus was indeed Edmund's son, not Alexander's. The secret she had guarded for 25 years was about to destroy everything they had built. "What did you tell him?" she asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the storm raging inside her. "I threw him out," Alexander replied firmly. "I told him that if he ever made such allegations again, I would have him arrested for treason and conspiracy against the crown." But Isabella, he didn't seem intimidated. If anything, he appeared sympathetic, as if he regretted having to bring this forward, but felt he had no choice. Isabella's mind raced through the timeline. Edmund's return to court 6 months ago, his careful observation of Marcus, the gathering of DNA evidence. It had all been planned. But why now? Why after 25 years of silence? "There's something else," Alexander continued, his voice growing darker. "Edmund mentioned that others know. He spoke of pressure from certain noble houses who have been questioning the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. Apparently, there have been whispers for years about Marcus's parentage, though I've never heard them myself." The political implications began to crystallize in Isabella's mind. The kingdom of Aldoria had always maintained its power through careful alliances and the perceived divine right of the bloodline to rule. If Marcus's legitimacy were questioned publicly, it could provide ammunition for political enemies, both within the kingdom and from neighboring territories that had long sought to challenge Valdoria's dominance in the region. "What are we going to do?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. Alexander stopped pacing and looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and pain. "We're going to fight this, Isabella. Whatever it takes, we protect our son and our kingdom. Marcus is my heir in every way that matters. I've raised him, taught him, prepared him to be king. No biological test can change the fact that he is my son." Isabella felt tears threatening, but forced them back. Alexander's loyalty to Marcus was absolute, as she had always known it would be. He had been there for every milestone: first steps, first words, graduation from the Royal Academy, his first diplomatic mission. In every meaningful sense, Alexander was Marcus's father. But would that be enough to weather the storm that was coming? "We need to tell Marcus," Alexander continued. "He deserves to know what accusations are being made and how we plan to handle them." And Isabella, he sat down beside her again, taking her hands in his. "I need you to tell me honestly, is there any truth to what Edmund claims? I need to know what we're dealing with." Isabella looked into her husband's eyes, seeing the love and trust that had grown between them over the years, and felt her heart break. In this moment, she had to choose between protecting the secret she had carried for 25 years and being honest with the man who had stood by her side through everything. The weight of the decision threatened to crush her, but she knew that whatever came next, it had to be built on truth. "Alexander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Part 2. The silence that followed Isabella's words stretched between them like an eternity. Alexander's hands, which had been holding hers with gentle reassurance, slowly released their grip. His face, which had shown determination and unwavering support just moments before, began to change as the implications of her confession settled in his mind. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice stripped of emotion in a way that made Isabella's heart ache. Taking a shuddering breath, Isabella began the story she had never intended to tell. She spoke of the loneliness she had felt during their early marriage, when Alexander had been consumed with learning to rule from his dying father. She described her friendship with Edmund, how it had provided comfort during those difficult months when she had felt more like a political arrangement than a beloved wife. She explained their shared interests, their long conversations about books and art, and dreams of seeing the world beyond the palace walls. "It was just once," she whispered, tears finally breaking free despite her efforts to maintain composure. "One night, when you were away on a diplomatic mission to the northern provinces. Edmund was leaving the next morning for his assignment in the eastern kingdoms, and we said goodbye in a way that should never have happened. Alexander had risen from the bench and was standing with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. The gentle sound of the fountain seemed to mock the devastation of the moment, its peaceful burbling a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in their carefully ordered world. When I discovered I was pregnant 3 months later, Isabella continued, I didn't know what to think. The timing could have meant either of you was the father, but when Marcus was born looking so much like you, I convinced myself that you were his biological father. I wanted it to be true so desperately that I made myself believe it was. Alexander turned slowly to face her, and Isabella was shocked by the pain etched across his features. This was not the anger she had expected, but something deeper, a profound sense of betrayal and loss that cut through 24 years of marriage and partnership. All these years, he said softly, all these years you've carried this secret. Every time I looked at Marcus with pride, every time I spoke about continuing our bloodline, every time I planned his future as king, you knew there was a possibility it was all built on a lie. I believed he was your son, Isabella said desperately. I truly believed it. When Edmund returned 6 months ago, and I saw him studying Marcus so intently, when I noticed certain gestures and mannerisms that reminded me of Edmund rather than you, that's when the doubts began to return. Alexander sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands. 25 years of uncertainty, and you never told me. We could have had the test done privately, could have known the truth, and dealt with it as a family. Instead, we're learning this from Edmund himself, with evidence gathered in secret and political enemies potentially waiting to use it against us. The weight of Isabella's choices pressed down upon her like a physical force. She had made decision after decision to protect what she thought was best for everyone. But in doing so, she had robbed her husband of the chance to make informed choices about his own life and kingdom. She had robbed Marcus of the opportunity to know his true parentage from those who loved him rather than from those who might use it against him. I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid of losing everything. You, Marcus, the kingdom, the life we had built together. Every year that passed made it harder to speak the truth and easier to believe that maybe it didn't matter anymore. Alexander looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a complicated mixture of love, anger, and deep sadness. It matters, Isabella. It matters because our son is about to marry Lady Catherine, cementing alliances that depend on his legitimacy as heir. It matters because there are laws governing succession that we have sworn to uphold. And it matters because somewhere out there, a man who may be Marcus's biological father has been living for 25 years without knowing his own child. The political ramifications began to cascade through Isabella's mind like a series of falling dominoes. Marcus's engagement to Lady Catherine Ashford was not simply a romantic alliance. It was a carefully negotiated treaty that would bring the powerful Ashford territories under closer royal control. The Ashford family had specifically requested assurances about the royal bloodline before agreeing to the marriage, wanting to ensure their daughter would someday be queen and their future grandchildren would have undisputed claim to the throne. Beyond that, there were the neighboring kingdoms of Astoria and Meridian, both of which had harbored ambitions to expand their influence into Valdorian territory. If Marcus's legitimacy were called into question, it could provide the justification they needed to support alternative claimants to the throne, distant cousins with weaker claims, but undisputed royal blood. We need to speak with Marcus immediately, Alexander said, standing with renewed purpose. Whatever the truth is, he needs to hear from us before anyone else has the chance to use it against him. Isabella nodded, though the thought of seeing the confusion and pain in her son's eyes made her feel physically ill. Marcus had always been close to both his parents, but he had a special relationship with Alexander. The king had personally overseen much of Marcus's education, teaching him statecraft and diplomacy, taking him on official visits to see how a ruler connects with his people. The bond between them was deep and genuine, built on years of shared experiences and mutual respect. "Where is he this morning?" Isabella asked. In his study, reviewing the final arrangements for the wedding with his advisors, Alexander replied, "Isabella, when we speak with him, we need to present a united front. Whatever mistakes were made in the past, we face this crisis together as a family." Isabella felt a surge of gratitude for Alexander's words. Despite his obvious pain and anger, he was choosing to prioritize their family's welfare over his personal feelings. It was exactly the kind of leadership that had made him a respected king, and she now realized the kind of character that made him a true father to Marcus regardless of biology. As they walked back toward the palace, Isabella's mind turned to Edmund. What did he hope to accomplish by revealing this secret now? During his years abroad, he had built a distinguished career as a diplomat and had never married or had children. Was this revelation driven by a father's desire to know his son, or was there some other motive? The timing, coming so close to Marcus's wedding, seemed particularly cruel. "Alexander," she said as they approached the palace doors, "what do you think Edmund wants from us?" Alexander paused, considering the question. "I'm not sure, but I suspect it's not money or power. Edmund has both of those in sufficient measure. If I had to guess, I would say he's either being pressured by others who want to destabilize the monarchy, or he trailed off, his expression growing thoughtful. Or what? Or he's genuinely concerned about Marcus's welfare. If word of these allegations spreads, and we're caught off guard, the damage could be catastrophic. By coming to us first, Edmund may be giving us the chance to control how this information comes to light." Isabella considered this possibility. She remembered Edmund as a man of honor, someone who had always put duty and loyalty above personal desire. If he was indeed Marcus's biological father, the knowledge must have been eating at him since his return to court. Perhaps his decision to come forward was an act of protection rather than aggression. As they entered the palace and made their way toward Marcus's study, Isabella tried to prepare herself for what might be the most difficult conversation of her life. How do you tell a young man who has been raised as a prince that his entire identity might be based on uncertainty? How do you explain to someone who has spent his whole life preparing to be king that his right to rule is now in question? Marcus's study was located in the east wing of the palace, in a suite of rooms that had been converted for his use when he reached adulthood. The space reflected his personality perfectly, shelves lined with books on history and philosophy, maps of the kingdom and surrounding regions, comfortable furniture that invited long conversations, and windows that offered stunning views of the capital city below. As they approached the study door, they could hear voices inside. Marcus speaking with his wedding coordinator and several advisors about the final details of the ceremony that was scheduled to take place in just 3 weeks. Isabella's heart clenched as she realized that everything they were about to discuss could potentially derail those carefully laid plans. Alexander knocked firmly on the door, and Marcus's voice called for them to enter. When they stepped inside, Isabella was struck by how handsome and confident her son looked, seated behind his desk with documents spread before him, his dark hair catching the morning light from the windows. Several advisors and the wedding coordinator immediately rose and bowed respectfully to the king and queen. "Your Majesties," Marcus said with a warm smile, standing to greet his parents. "I wasn't expecting you this morning. We're just finalizing the seating arrangements for the cathedral ceremony." Alexander's expression was grave as he addressed the assembled advisors. "I need to speak privately with Prince Marcus. Please continue this meeting later this afternoon." The advisors quickly gathered their materials and filed out, sensing the serious tone in the king's voice. Once the door closed behind them, Marcus looked between his parents with growing concern. "What's happened?" he asked immediately. "Has there been news from the Northern Territories? Problems with the Ashford alliance?" Alexander moved to the window, gazing out at the city below as if drawing strength from the sight of his kingdom. Isabella remained near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, struggling to find words for what needed to be said. "Marcus," Alexander began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "this morning I received some very serious allegations that concern you directly. Before I explain what they are, I want you to know that your mother and I will handle this situation together, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, will change how we feel about you or your place in this family." Marcus moved around his desk to face his parents directly, his expression shifting from concern to alarm. "What kind of allegations?" Alexander took a deep breath. Lord Edmund Blackwood has claimed that he is your biological father. He says he has DNA evidence to support this claim, and he's demanded a private audience to discuss the matter further. The color drained from Marcus's face as he processed these words. He looked from Alexander to Isabella and back again, searching their expressions for some sign that this was a misunderstanding or elaborate joke. "That's impossible," he said finally. "Lord Blackwood barely speaks to me at court functions. Why would he make such an outrageous claim?" Isabella stepped forward, knowing that the time had come to tell her son the whole truth. "Marcus, there's something I need to explain to you about the early years of my marriage to your father." As she began to tell the story she had just shared with Alexander, Isabella watched her son's face go through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, hurt, and, finally, a kind of stunned acceptance as the pieces began to fall into place in his mind. When she finished, Marcus sank into the chair behind his desk, his hands gripping the armrests as he stared at the floor. The silence stretched for several long moments before he looked up at Alexander. "Did you know?" he asked quietly. "All these years, did you suspect?" Alexander moved to stand beside Marcus's chair, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "No, son, I had no idea. But I want you to understand something very clearly. You are my child in every way that matters. I've been your father since the day you were born, and no test result will ever change that." Marcus nodded slowly, but Isabella could see the questions and doubts swirling in his eyes. She knew her son well enough to understand that he would need time to process this revelation and all its implications. The young man who had always been so certain of his place in the world was now faced with the possibility that everything he thought he knew about himself might be wrong. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding older somehow, weighted with new responsibilities and concerns. "Now," Alexander said firmly, "we decide how to handle this as a family. We control the narrative, we protect the kingdom, and we ensure that your wedding to Catherine proceeds as planned." But even as Alexander spoke these confident words, Isabella could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They were about to enter uncharted territory, where the very foundations of their monarchy would be tested, and where the choices they made in the coming days would determine not just their family's future, but the fate of an entire kingdom. Part 3. 3 days had passed since the devastating revelation in Marcus's study, and Castle Valdoria felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. The normal rhythms of palace life continued on the surface. Servants attended to their duties, courtiers maintained their schedules, and official business proceeded as usual. But underneath, the royal family was grappling with a crisis that threatened to tear apart everything they had built. Marcus had barely slept since learning the truth about his possible parentage. He spent his days fulfilling his official duties with mechanical precision, while his nights were consumed by restless pacing in his chambers. The young man who had once moved through the palace with easy confidence now seemed to second-guess every step, every word, every gesture that might reveal his inner turmoil to the ever-watchful eyes of the court. Isabella had retreated into a kind of protective numbness, attending formal functions with her usual grace while privately torturing herself with guilt and regret. She caught herself studying Marcus's face during meals, searching for resemblances to Edmund that she had trained herself not to see for 25 years. Every shared glance with Alexander carried the weight of their fractured trust, and every smile she offered to visiting dignitaries felt like a betrayal of the chaos brewing beneath the surface. Alexander had thrown himself into the political aspects of their crisis with characteristic determination. He had spent hours in private consultation with the kingdom's most trusted legal advisors, exploring every possible option for protecting Marcus's claim to the throne. The law was clear on matters of legitimate succession, but it had never anticipated a situation quite like this one, where the legitimacy itself was being questioned after 25 years of accepted fact. On this particular morning, as autumn rain drummed against the palace windows, the royal family had gathered in Alexander's private office for a meeting that would determine their next steps. The room was smaller and more intimate than the formal throne room, with rich wooden paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a large mahogany desk that had belonged to Alexander's father and grandfather before him. I've reviewed every legal precedent and historical case, Alexander began, setting down a thick folder filled with documents. The situation is complex, but not necessarily hopeless. There are several examples in our kingdom's history where questions of parentage were resolved in favor of maintaining stability. Marcus looked up from the window where he had been watching the rain. What kind of examples? 2 centuries ago, King Ferdinand III faced similar accusations from a rival claimant who alleged that the king was not his father's biological son. The royal council determined that since Ferdinand had been raised as the heir, had received proper royal education, and had the support of the people, the accusations were irrelevant to his fitness to rule. Isabella leaned forward in her chair. But were the accusations true in that case? Unknown, Alexander replied. No DNA testing existed then, obviously, but the principle was established that legitimacy comes from more than just bloodline. It comes from preparation, competence, and acceptance by the people and nobility. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded Isabella painfully of Edmund. That's all very encouraging from a historical perspective, but we're not living 2 centuries ago. If Edmund has DNA evidence, and if he chooses to make it public, then we need to control how that information is revealed, Alexander said firmly. Which brings me to the decision we need to make today. Do we contact Edmund ourselves and arrange a private meeting, or do we wait for him to make the next move? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella knew that reaching out to Edmund would be an admission that they were taking his claims seriously, but ignoring him could lead to a public revelation that would catch them completely off guard. I think we need to hear what he wants, Marcus said quietly. If he's really my biological father, then he's had to live with that knowledge for months while watching me from a distance. That can't have been easy for him. Isabella was struck by her son's compassion, even in the midst of his own crisis. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful response that made him an excellent candidate for kingship, regardless of his parentage. I agree, she said, but we need to set the terms. This meeting happens here in the palace with all of us present. We don't go to him. Alexander nodded approvingly. We'll send word through official channels. A formal request for an audience to discuss the allegations he brought to my attention. If he's sincere about wanting to handle this properly, he'll accept our conditions. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock came at the office door. Alexander called for the visitor to enter, and Lady Margaret Winters appeared with a concerned expression on her face. Your Majesty, she said with a curtsy, Lord Edmund Blackwood has requested an immediate audience. He says it's urgent and relates to the matter you discussed earlier this week. The 3 family members exchanged glances. Edmund's timing seemed almost supernatural in its precision. Where is he now? Alexander asked. In the blue drawing room, Your Majesty. He's alone and appears quite anxious. Alexander stood, straightening his jacket with decisive movements. Very well. We'll see him now. Lady Margaret, please ensure we're not disturbed under any circumstances. As they made their way through the palace corridors toward the blue drawing room, Isabella felt her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. She hadn't spoken directly to Edmund since his return to court 6 months ago, and the prospect of facing him now, with Alexander and Marcus present, filled her with dread. The blue drawing room was one of the palace's more intimate formal spaces, decorated in soft blue and gold tones with elegant furniture arranged for comfortable conversation. Edmund stood with his back to them when they entered, gazing out the tall windows at the rain-soaked gardens. When he turned to face them, Isabella was struck by how much he had aged since she had last really looked at him closely. Lord Edmund Blackwood was 53 years old, just 1 year older than Isabella, but his years of diplomatic service in harsh climates had weathered his face and turned his once dark hair completely silver. He was still handsome in a distinguished way, but there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of difficult choices and heavy burdens. Your Majesties, Your Highness, he said with a formal bow. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Lord Blackwood, Alexander replied with cool politeness. You said this was urgent. Edmund's gaze moved to Marcus, and Isabella saw something pass between them, a moment of recognition that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Did Marcus see it too? The way Edmund's eyes softened, the slight tremor in his hands as he clasped them behind his back? I've come to apologize, Edmund began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. My approach earlier this week was inappropriate, and I regret the distress it has caused your family. However, I felt I had no choice but to bring this matter to your attention because others have become aware of the situation. Others? Alexander's voice sharpened with alarm. Edmund nodded gravely. Lady Patricia Ashford approached me 2 weeks ago with questions about Prince Marcus's parentage. Apparently, certain members of her family have been researching the royal bloodlines in preparation for the wedding, and they've noticed irregularities in the timing of the prince's birth relative to documented periods when your majesty was away from the capital. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Lady Patricia was Catherine's aunt and the unofficial head of the powerful Ashford family. If she had suspicions about Marcus's legitimacy, it could destroy not only the upcoming wedding, but also the political alliance it represented. What exactly does Lady Patricia know? Marcus asked, speaking for the first time since they had entered the room. Edmund's eyes met Marcus's directly, and Isabella saw the pain there. The look of a man who was seeing his son up close for the first time while knowing he might never have the chance to claim that relationship. She has documentation showing that King Alexander was away on a 6-week diplomatic mission to the northern provinces during the time when Prince Marcus would have been conceived, Edmund replied carefully. She also has records of my presence at court during that same period, and she's apparently been asking questions about the nature of my friendship with Queen Isabella at that time. The implications hit them all like a physical blow. If the Ashford family had already conducted their own investigation and reached conclusions about Marcus's parentage, the royal family's carefully maintained secret was no longer secret at all. How long have you known? Marcus asked quietly. About the possibility that you're my father? Edmund's composure cracked slightly, and Isabella saw tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I began to suspect when I returned to court and saw you for the first time as an adult. There were similarities that couldn't be ignored. But I didn't pursue testing until Lady Patricia's questions made me realize that others were already investigating. I felt it was better to know the truth than to allow speculation and rumors to grow. And the DNA results? Alexander's voice was carefully controlled. Conclusive, Edmund replied simply. With 99.7% certainty, Prince Marcus is my biological son. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and consequence that would spread far beyond this moment. Isabella watched her son's face as he processed this confirmation of what they had all begun to suspect, and she saw him age years in a matter of seconds. What do you want from us? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Edmund shook his head slowly. Nothing for myself, Your Highness. I gave up any right to make claims on you 25 years ago when I chose not to stay and fight for your mother. All I want now is to help you navigate this crisis in a way that protects your future and the stability of the kingdom. Alexander stepped forward, his king's authority evident in every line of his posture. And how do you propose we do that? By getting ahead of the story, Edmund replied. Lady Patricia has scheduled a meeting with me for tomorrow morning. She intends to present her evidence and demand explanations that could be damaging to everyone involved. We need to have a strategy in place before then. Isabella found her voice for the first time since they had entered the room. What kind of strategy? Edmund looked at her with an expression that held both regret and determination. We need to decide whether to acknowledge the truth privately to key allies while maintaining public silence, or whether to get ahead of potential rumors by making a controlled public disclosure. Either way, we need to ensure that Prince Marcus's position as heir remains secure. Marcus moved to the window, staring out at the storm clouds gathering over the kingdom. Can my position remain secure? If I'm not the king's biological son, Don't the laws of succession become complicated? Alexander joined his son at the window, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. The law recognizes you as my legitimate heir. You were born within marriage, acknowledged as my son, and raised as the crown prince. Your biological parentage doesn't automatically disqualify you from succession, but it gives ammunition to anyone who wants to challenge my claim, Marcus said quietly. Yes, Edmund acknowledged from behind them. It does, which is why we need to be very strategic about how we handle this information going forward. As the four of them stood in the blue drawing room, surrounded by the elegant trappings of royal power, but facing a crisis that threatened to undermine everything they represented, Isabella realized that they were at a crossroads. The decisions they made in the next few days would determine not just their family's future, but the future of the monarchy itself. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and inside the palace, for people who were bound together by love, duty, and a 25-year-old secret prepared to fight for everything they held dear. Part for the following morning dawned gray and ominous, with fog rolling in from the mountains to shroud Castle Valdoria in an ethereal mist that seemed to reflect the uncertainty hanging over the royal family. In the Queen's private sitting room, Isabella stood before an ornate mirror while her lady-in-waiting carefully arranged her hair for what would prove to be one of the most important days of her life. The plan they had developed the night before was both simple and complex. Rather than wait for Lady Patricia Ashford to control the narrative, they would take the initiative. Alexander had arranged for an emergency meeting of the Royal Privy Council for that afternoon, while Edmund would keep his appointment with Lady Patricia, but under their terms rather than hers. Marcus, meanwhile, would finally have to make the hardest decision of his life, whether to step back from his claim to the throne or fight for it despite the clouds over his legitimacy. Your Majesty, Lady Margaret said softly as she entered the sitting room, Prince Marcus has requested to see you before the council meeting. He's in the rose garden. Isabella nodded, her stomach tight with anxiety about what her son might have decided during his sleepless night of contemplation. She had barely seen him since their meeting with Edmund, and she knew he was struggling with questions that no young man should have to face, questions about his identity, his purpose, and his place in the world. The Rose Garden had always been Marcus's favorite retreat within the palace grounds. Even as a child, he had preferred its peaceful pathways to the more formal areas of the estate, often taking his tutors there for lessons or simply sitting alone with his thoughts. Isabella found him now on the stone bench where she and Alexander had shared their devastating conversation just days earlier. "Marcus," she said softly as she approached, noting how the morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair that reminded her so painfully of Edmund. He looked up at her with eyes that held a new maturity, a gravity that hadn't been there a week ago. "Mother, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Isabella sat beside him, preparing herself for whatever question was coming. "Do you regret it?" Marcus asked quietly. "That night with Edmund, do you regret that it happened, knowing what it led to?" The question struck Isabella like a physical blow, forcing her to confront emotions she had buried for 25 years. She looked at her son, this remarkable young man who had brought such joy and pride to her life, and realized that for all the pain and complications his parentage had caused, she could never truly regret the event that had brought him into existence. "How can I regret something that gave me you?" she said finally. "Yes, I regret the circumstances, the secrecy, the pain it's caused your father and you. But, Marcus, you are the greatest blessing of my life. I could never regret your existence, no matter how complicated the circumstances of your conception." Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to find some peace in her answer. "I made my decision about the throne," he said. "I wanted to tell you first, before the council meeting." Isabella's heart clenched with dread. "What have you decided?" "I'm going to fight for it," Marcus said firmly. "Not because I believe blood makes a king, but because I've been prepared for this role my entire life. I know this kingdom, I understand its people, and I'm ready to serve them. If enemies want to use my parentage against me, then let them try. I'll prove my worth through my actions, not my genetics." Relief flooded through Isabella, followed immediately by fierce pride. Her son was choosing to face this crisis with courage and determination, exactly as a true leader should. "Alexander will be proud of your decision," she said. "As am I." Marcus smiled for the first time since this ordeal began. "He's been more of a father to me than any biological parent could be. I'm not going to let political enemies use DNA tests to take away everything he's taught me to be." As they sat in the garden, sharing a moment of calm before the storms ahead, Isabella reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 25 years ago, she had made a choice driven by loneliness and passion that she thought would destroy everything she held dear. Today, that choice had led to consequences she could never have imagined, but it had also given her a son whose character would have made any parent proud. By midday, the palace was buzzing with unusual activity as members of the Royal Privy Council arrived for the emergency session. These 12 men and women represented the most powerful noble houses in the kingdom, along with senior advisors and ministers who helped govern the realm. They were accustomed to being consulted on matters of war and peace, trade, and diplomacy, but they had never been asked to address a crisis quite like this one. Alexander had spent the morning in careful preparation, consulting with the kingdom's most senior legal scholars about the precedents and procedures that would govern their discussion. The Royal Seal of Succession, an ancient document that established the laws of inheritance for the crown, would be their guide, but its language had been written centuries before DNA testing existed. In the great council chamber, with its soaring ceiling and portraits of previous monarchs looking down from the walls, Alexander called the meeting to order with all the dignity and authority of his office. Isabella sat to his right, maintaining perfect composure despite the turmoil in her heart, while Marcus stood behind his father's chair in his traditional position as heir apparent. "My lords and ladies," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I have called this emergency session to address allegations that have been made regarding the legitimacy of Prince Marcus's claim to the throne." The murmur that rippled through the assembled council members confirmed what Alexander had suspected. Rumors were already spreading through the noble houses, and their political enemies were beginning to mobilize. "These allegations concern the biological parentage of the prince," Alexander continued, "and while I reject them as irrelevant to his fitness to rule, we must address them directly to prevent them from being used to destabilize our kingdom." Lord Chancellor William Fairfax, the most senior member of the council, leaned forward in his ornate chair. "Your Majesty, are you saying that Prince Marcus's legitimacy as heir is being questioned?" "I am saying that political enemies are attempting to use unsubstantiated claims about the prince's parentage to undermine his succession," Alexander replied carefully. "However, I want to be clear that Prince Marcus remains my legitimate heir under all applicable laws, regardless of any biological testing that may have been conducted." Lady Catherine's aunt, Lady Patricia Ashford, had requested permission to address the council, and Alexander had agreed, knowing that confronting her accusations directly was better than allowing them to fester in private. She rose now from her seat near the back of the chamber, her expression grim but determined. "Your Majesty," Lady Patricia said, "with respect, the Ashford family has conducted research that raises serious questions about the prince's bloodline. We have documented evidence that you were absent from the capital during the period when Prince Marcus would have been conceived, and we have reason to believe that Lord Edmund Blackwood may be the prince's biological father." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Isabella forced herself to maintain her composed expression while internally marveling at how quickly political alliances could shift when power was at stake. Marcus stepped forward, drawing himself up to his full height as he prepared to speak for himself. "Lady Patricia, I appreciate your family's concern for the integrity of the royal bloodline. However, I would like to remind this council that legitimacy comes from more than genetics. It comes from preparation, dedication, and the ability to serve our people with wisdom and justice." "But surely, Your Highness," interjected Lord Richard Pemberton, another council member, "the law requires that the heir be the biological child of the monarch." Alexander stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. Lord Pemberton, I direct your attention to the Royal Seal of Succession, Article 7, which states that legitimacy requires birth within royal marriage and acknowledgement by the sovereign. Prince Marcus meets both requirements fully. There is no provision in our law that requires biological testing to confirm parentage, nor should there be. The legal argument was sound, but Isabella could see that political considerations were more complex. Several council members were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, torn between their loyalty to the crown and their concern for the stability of the succession. Lord Edmund Blackwood, who had been granted permission to address the council at the appropriate time, now rose from his position near the chamber doors. Every eye in the room turned to him as he walked slowly to the center of the chamber, carrying himself with the dignity that had served him well during decades of diplomatic service. Your Majesty, members of the council, Edmund began, his voice clear and steady, I am the person at the center of these allegations, and I believe the time has come for complete honesty. Isabella's heart stopped beating as she realized that Edmund was about to reveal everything. She caught Alexander's eye and saw her own panic reflected there, but there was nothing they could do to stop what was coming. 25 years ago, Edmund continued, I had a brief relationship with Queen Isabella during a period when both of us were young and facing difficult circumstances. Prince Marcus is indeed my biological son. The explosion of shock that swept through the council chamber was unlike anything in Isabella's memory. Council members rose from their seats, voices raised in confusion and demand for explanation, while guards moved nervously near the doors. Alexander remained seated, his face a mask of royal composure, while Marcus stood perfectly still behind his chair. However, Edmund continued, raising his voice above the chaos. I want to make something absolutely clear to this council and to the kingdom. I make no claim on Prince Marcus or on the throne. He was raised by King Alexander, educated by King Alexander, and prepared for leadership by King Alexander. In every meaningful sense, Alexander is his father, and I am merely a footnote in his history. The chamber gradually quieted as Edmund's words sank in. Lady Patricia Ashford looked stunned, clearly not having expected this direct admission, coupled with explicit support for Marcus's claim. Furthermore, Edmund continued, I have sworn an oath of allegiance to this crown and to this heir. Any attempt to use my biological relationship with Prince Marcus to undermine his succession will be met with my complete opposition. I will testify before any court, sign any document, or take any action necessary to support his legitimate claim to the throne. Alexander rose slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of royal authority. Lord Edmund Blackwood, your honesty and loyalty to the crown are noted and appreciated. To the members of this council, I ask you to consider what truly makes a worthy heir, bloodline alone, or the combination of education, character, and dedication to service that Prince Marcus has demonstrated throughout his life. Marcus stepped forward once more, and Isabella was amazed by the calm confidence he projected in this moment of ultimate crisis. My lords and ladies, I stand before you as the man King Alexander raised me to be. If you have concerns about my fitness to rule, I invite you to examine my education, my service to the kingdom, and my commitment to our people. But I will not allow political enemies to use a private family matter to deny our kingdom the stable succession it deserves. The debate that followed was intense, but ultimately decisive. One by one, the members of the Royal Privy Council confirmed their support for Marcus's succession, influenced by Edmund's public support and Marcus's own dignified handling of the crisis. Lady Patricia Ashford, finding herself isolated without the ammunition she had expected Edmund's testimony to provide, graciously withdrew her family's objections. As the formal session concluded and council members began to file out of the chamber, Isabella felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering anxiety about the future. The immediate crisis had passed, but the secret that had shaped her life for 25 years was now public knowledge among the kingdom's most powerful families. Alexander approached Edmund as the chamber emptied, extending his hand in a gesture of reconciliation and respect. Lord Blackwood, I will not pretend that this situation has been easy for any of us, but your conduct today has been exemplary. Edmund grasped the king's hand firmly. Your Majesty, you have raised a remarkable young man. It has been an honor to see the kind of leader he has become under your guidance. Marcus stepped forward, looking at Edmund with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. Lord Edmund, I hope that in time we might develop a relationship based on who we are today, rather than the circumstances of the past. I would like that very much, Your Highness, Edmund replied, and Isabella saw tears threatening in both men's eyes. As the four of them stood together in the ancient council chamber, surrounded by the weight of history and the promise of the future, Isabella realized that sometimes the most devastating secrets, when finally brought into the light, could become the foundation for unexpected healing and stronger bonds than ever before. 3 weeks later, Prince Marcus married Lady Catherine Ashford in a ceremony that celebrated not only their union, but also the triumph of love, loyalty, and dedication over the accidents of biology. And in the years that followed, the kingdom would remember this crisis not as a scandal that weakened the monarchy, but as the moment when their future king proved himself worthy of the crown through the content of his character rather than the circumstances of his birth.